How is everyone doing today? Good? Thank you for being here. This has been an amazing conference already for me and hopefully also for you. I'm Sasha Czarkowski. You probably know me as Sasha Rosenbaum. I managed to change my name to one that is much harder to spell so that you can never spell it again or find me on the internet. But of course, I do want you to find me on the internet, so please find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or whatever social media you favor. I would love to continue the conversations that we start today. This talk is about learning, and it's both about personal learning and organizational learning. And it's because at one point in my career, I realized that learning is the biggest part of what we do in technology, because this field moves so fast that we're all perpetual newbies and we constantly need to learn something new. And nobody teaches us how to learn with as much schooling as we do. Nobody really explains to us how to approach this. So a lot of us struggle and kind of have a bad experience with this. So hopefully I can give you some ideas on how to improve this. So to introduce myself, I've been in technology for 20-ish years by now, and I've been in development, operations, products. I've reported to sales, to marketing. I've literally done every job in the industry. I've worked for some companies you may have heard of, and I've now been part of DevOps Days for about 10 years. And I've recently started a new venture with I was foolish enough to start a company, but I did it with some of the most intelligent people I know, Jay Bloom and Andrew Clay Schaefer. You might know one of both of them, and in particular, Andrew was a founding member of DevOps Days. So before we get started, I want to ask you a couple questions. So if I make this statement, you can learn new things, but you can't really change how intelligent you are. From 0 to 100%, how much do you agree with this statement? 0. Anybody agrees with this very, very strong? Okay. So a couple people maybe agree with this. Okay. And the second question is, do you ever in your self-talk, do you call yourself lazy? Okay. That got some, so I keep learning about learning. This talk today is very, very different from when I first started giving it, because I keep discovering new insights. And there is an insight that I discovered recently that resonated very deeply with me, and that is that all meaningful learning is really self-directed. So it comes from Carl Rogers, who is a founding member of humanistic psychology, and he says, we cannot teach another person directly, we can only facilitate learning. So for you to learn something new, you have to be motivated to learn, you have to be interested, you have to be wanting to solve a problem. And then I, as a teacher, cannot actually impart knowledge on you. I can only help you get there. So, of course, this begs the question, if I can't teach you anything, why am I trying to teach you something? So the answer to that is a fake Buddha quote, and it says, when a student is ready, the teacher will appear. And so I believe this, like, I'm hoping that a lot of you are ready for the insights that I might be able to offer. And I might be able to meet you at the part of your journey that you're on and maybe offer some new ideas, maybe reinforce some ideas you already had. So really you arrive and like join this journey with me towards getting better at learning. And also, I can provide you with a long, long list of resources that went into making of this talk, and this is not exhaustive. But really, I am not just putting it here to say, like, I read all these books so you don't have to. But first of all, I do want you to read some of them. They're pretty amazing, a lot of them. But also, I'm using certain terminology, kind of repeating certain terms that you may have heard of before. I don't want you to think that I'm basing this on one study or one book. This really is a lot of studies kind of combined together, and certain insights start to emerge from multiple directions, whether or not they're calling it the same terms. So I want to tell you a personal story, and maybe some of you will relate to the personal story. But when I was a kid, I love books. I loved learning. You could find me with a nose in a book almost any hour of the day. I read everything. I wanted to learn about anything from physics to biology to sci-fi to anything. The world was just an interesting place, and I loved learning about it. I kind of skated through high school. I, got good grades, didn't have to invest much effort in it. Then I went to one of the best technical schools in the world, and clicker. And, I enrolled in biology department, and then I had the first lab, and we grew drosophilas in yeast. And I was like, this is not what I want to do with my life. So after one semester in biology, I transferred to computer science, which was the best decision I ever made. But the problem with that was in biology, the first semester, I scored 94 out of 100. And in computer science, the first semester, I scored 68% out of 100, which means that I largely got C in all of my exams. And this is something that has never happened before. So this was my face when I got the scores for the first semester. And so then logically I said, okay, this school has been, at the time I was there, was rated one of the top 20 in the world by some world ranking and, world. So I'm competing with the best computer science students on the planet. Obviously, I need to study harder so I can raise up the bar. And so I went into the library and I got textbooks, and they stopped working. Someone who loved books before, who loved learning before, suddenly I was having a horrible experience with this. I was sitting next to a textbook, and I was experiencing horrible anxiety, and I couldn't learn anything. So, of course, naturally, as most students do, instead I went partying. So I spent a few semesters actually partying and avoiding learning at all costs. This picture is here not just because it's a picture of a party, but because at one point, instead of studying for the next math exam, I actually watched all of the seasons of Sex and the City in a row. I can promise you this show is not worth it. I was just trying to avoid doing something more important. So this is a very classic fixed mindset. And the concept of growth mindset, and fixed mindset comes from this book and this research by a psychologist named Carol Dweck. So 5 years ago, the problem with growth mindset was that nobody knew what growth mindset is. And now the problem with growth mindset is that everybody thinks they know what growth mindset is. So it's kind of like a DevOps transformation. Every company thinks they're already doing DevOps, therefore they don't think they need to improve at DevOps. But you know as a practitioner that we always need to improve at DevOps. But so if I define the mindsets, the fixed mindset is that you say you can always learn new things, but you can't really change how intelligent you are. And the growth mindset says that you can always substantially change how intelligent you are. And this is not a binary. Right? You can be anywhere on this scale, so you can be anywhere from fixed to growth, and you can move on the scale depending on your experiences. And also, you can have different mindsets pertaining to different parts of your life. So you can believe that intelligence is fixed, but physical ability can be trained through exercise. Or you can believe that creative ability, for instance, is something inborn that you can't change, but you could change, for instance, your intelligence. So speaking of creative ability, this is me drawing. And this is also me drawing. Obviously, I'm trying to make a point here, so hopefully you see the picture well enough. This is a book I'm reading about drawing. So after 40 years, I decided that I'm actually going to try to learn to draw. And it's interesting in many ways, right? Because I read about 20% of the book, and I think my skills at drawing improved tremendously. And of course, this book doesn't just give you verbal instructions, it gives you a lot of exercises, because the problem with a lot of concepts in our life is that we can't learn them through verbal instruction. In fact, there's research that in some cases, verbal instruction actually decreases your performance. So you can do better at certain tasks before you give an instruction on how to do the task, and then you do worse because you overthink it. So there is, in fact, another really good book about that. So if you want to learn something like a physical skill, there's this book called The Inner Game of Tennis. It's pretty old, but it's pretty good. And the quote from here is, "Fortunately, most children learn to walk before they can be told how to." Because the entire book is essentially about how when we try to control what we do through our body with our mind, we actually impede our performance, right? So verbal instruction in many cases is not what we want. What we want is practice. And if you think that technology is very different and technology is all cognitive and we learn it all through verbal instruction, think about how many of you would prefer to learn a new skill in a hackathon rather than a lecture. And how many complex skills cannot even be learned in the verbal instruction. So like, how do you learn how to handle an incident? You don't learn it from a book. It's pretty impossible. So I want to address the question that comes up a lot when you talk about growth mindset, and it's like, am I saying that there's no such thing as talent? And the answer to that is yes and no. It depends. It would have been a better answer. So the answer to that is it depends. So there is this concept of $10,000 rule, and it was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell, and he says like, okay, to achieve mastery in a field, you just need to invest 10,000 hours in it. So, you know, the talent doesn't matter. What matters is how much work you put into it. Now, the research behind this comes from Anders Ericsson, who later wrote this book, in which he kind of makes fun of Gladwell for misunderstanding his research, which is kind of funny. So one of the things is, like, they didn't really say that initial ability didn't matter. They said that people with sort of similar initial ability, the hours of practice mattered. But the more important insight is that it needed to be deliberate practice. And deliberate practice involves feedback and modification of efforts in response to that feedback. So think about all the people playing tennis on the weekend after weekend, but they never get any better in the game, because they're not engaged in deliberate practice. They're playing for fun, quote unquote, right? And pros really engage in deliberate practice. They pick a sub-skill and they try to improve it, and they try to get really quality feedback on what they're doing. There's also a concept of kind versus wicked domains, and it has nothing to do with how difficult the domain is. It had everything to do with presence of accurate immediate feedback. So one of the studies he did was about doctors, and so it turns out surgeons improve at their practice through experience because they get immediate feedback on the mistakes they make. And radiologists do not improve through experience because they never get feedback. So like they diagnose a picture and then they may never see the patient and know whether or not the diagnosis was correct. So they actually do not improve through experience. So that's another thing that happens. You want to be having immediate and accurate feedback because that's the easiest way for humans to learn. And then I think there are studies on this that are potentially contradictory, but I think my bottom line from the reading this is your starting point matters, but effort and feedback are the key. And this is manifesting in two ways. So one is when you have initial ability in a certain field, you get a lot of encouragement to be in that field. And there's a bunch of studies on this in terms of physical ability and intelligence. So for instance, if you walk into a classroom and you pick kids at random and you tell the teacher that these kids are gifted, at the end of the year, they will be having much significantly better outcomes than the other kids because the teacher invested the time in them because they were told they're gifted. So there is that. There is also, like, you actually, like, I'm 5'4", I'm probably not going to be a good basketball player, no matter how I try. But then there's another thing, which is, even if you're really good at the field and you had talent and you had encouragement and you got really good, eventually you reach the performance levels at which things become difficult. And then what matters is your mindset, right? Because if you have a fixed mindset, you reach the difficult point and you hit the wall and you can't progress. So to come back to definitions, what largely fixed mindset is saying is you believe that your inborn abilities determine your outcomes. And growth mindset is saying that your effort and the feedback you get on that effort is what determines your outcomes. And the reason I think from everything that I learned about learning that I'm very, very invested in the growth mindset concept is because believing that you're limited by your inborn abilities is highly limiting belief. So if I think that I can never jump higher than a certain level, then I will perpetually sort of be stuck in trying to prove that I'm smart enough for something. right? And in fact, in the past, I often found myself in this situation where, like, I'm like, am I smart enough for this test? Am I smart enough for this meeting? Am I smart enough for this conversation, right? And so the way I see it, you have two choices when you have presented with learning abilities. You can suffer while trying to prove yourself, or you can enjoy yourself while trying to improve yourself. And your life experience, not just your learning outcomes, but your life experience is usually significantly better when you choose the latter. But the stories we tell ourselves are not that. So our culture is largely unaware of growth mindset. So instead we say, oh, I'm lazy. So when I couldn't study in the university, what I told myself is I told myself I was very lazy. We also tell our kids they're lazy, and we also tell our employees they're lazy. We constantly sort of use this word, but like, are you lazy? So I love cats. Cats are amazing animals. They can sleep from 12 to 16 hours a day, and the rest of the time they engage in usually lounging. As long as they're fed, they will be sort of lying around looking pretty. This joke now requires an explanation I don't have time for. You can find me after this talk. But I can promise you that you are not a cat. And I have a test for you. So after this conference, you can go home, you can sit on your couch, you turn off all your devices, and you try to do nothing for 5 minutes. I can promise you that you can't do nothing for 5 minutes. And in fact, you will have an urge to do something, and maybe even something creative. So I'll quote Deming here saying, people are born with intrinsic motivation, self-esteem, dignity, curiosity to learn, joy in learning, right? So we really born learners, and we really find joy in achieving mastery. We have this natural tendency to want to achieve mastery in everything we do. More than that, procrastinating doesn't mean absence of work. So this is Dynamon here saying, you're lazy, no, constantly stressing about the things and putting off actually involves quite a bit of work. So the choice is not like whether or not you're working, but what kind of work you're engaging in. And part of it is unpleasant, right? So then why are we avoiding and procrastinating if we're not lazy? And we do it out of fear. And so as long as our fear of the task is bigger than the fear of the of procrastination, we will engage in procrastination. So if I look at everything that I saw about learning, organizational or personal, then what emerges as the clearest insight is the fear is the enemy of learning. And in particular, threat to self is an enemy of learning. So this threat to self can be real. So you can have a toxic boss, or you can have a highly demanding parent that like scare you and promise to punish you, and that way you're worried about your learning outcomes, right? And you can have a self-imposed threat to self, which either comes from your prior life experiences or just for whatever reason you have developed this fixed mindset and you think that you're constantly trying to prove yourself. This is another insight from Carl Rogers saying, the educational system which most effectively promotes significant learning is one in which threat to self as learner is reduced to a minimum. And I'm here to posit that we do not, in fact, for the most part, have such educational systems. In fact, we usually have the opposite educational systems. So I actually think the true challenge is that the game is rigged against us from the very beginning, from us being little kids, because our schools are actually excellent in reinforcing fixed mindset. So they constantly evaluate, they constantly grade, they constantly tell you that you belong in a bucket, right? And the other thing that our schools do today, and I hope it changes in the future, really, because the schools trained us to think that there is a single, correct, noble answer to every question, whereas in the real world, it really doesn't work like that. The real world is full of complexity and ambiguity, and a lot of problems do not have single correct answers. So we constantly evaluate and classify students, and if you talk to teachers, actually they will tell you that it's worse today than 10 years ago, and then 20 years ago, and then 30 years ago, and actually gets worse all the time. We overemphasize the testing and evaluation in sacrifice of real learning outcomes and in sacrifice of creativity. Little known fact, the IQ test was designed by Alfred Binet to measure progress, not ability. So Alfred Binet actually believed that many students are not adequately served by schools, and he designed a test to evaluate whether or not kids are improving. But instead, we're using this test to put kids in the buckets and imply that the buckets can never be changed, right? So you're this gifted, and you're this gifted, and you're this gifted, and you're going to remain there all your life. This is a horrible message to tell little kids. The other thing that is very controversial in the world of psychology today is the concept of praise. So we used to, 20, 30 years ago, we used to believe that praise is a really good thing. We should praise people all the time, and we should praise people for who they are, right? And so in her research, Carol Dweck tested two types of praise. Praise for ability, so like how smart or talented you are, versus praise for effort. So they did this interesting study. They took little kids and they gave them puzzles that were easy to solve. And then one group of kids, they praised them for, oh, you did so well, you must be really smart. And the other group of kids, they told them, oh, you did so well, you must have done a lot of work for this. And then they gave them harder puzzles that the kids couldn't solve. So in the ability praise and the smart praise, the kids gave up really easily, did not have fun with the next puzzles, and lied about their results to say they actually solved more than they could. So in fact, the ability praise negatively impacted the very ability it was praising, which may sound counterintuitive, but honestly, if you have kids or employees or yourself, please don't tell them how smart they are. This is actually shooting them in the foot. But in fact, there's new research that actually says that maybe not the smart praise or the effort praise is what we should be doing, but what we should be doing is informational feedback. And it posits that probably the best learning outcomes actually come when we give people adequate informational feedback on their efforts, because, again, we have this internal drive to achieve mastery, and we want to learn and we want to be better. So what we really need is feedback, not praise. The other thing that happens in our culture is our hero stories erase all mention of effort. So we say, whether it's a startup founder or it's a rock star or it's a basketball player, we always tell a story of how they're genius and really gifted. We do not talk about how much effort they put into achieving success. So if you read stories about Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods, no one talks about how hard they worked. So like Tiger Woods, for instance, was trained by his father to play golf from the age of 4 or something like that. But no one talks about that. Everybody talks about how he's amazingly gifted and great. And that's because effort is the thing we're afraid of in fixed mindset. So in fixed mindset, effort is a bad thing. It, like failure, means that you're not smart or talented. If you were, you wouldn't need effort. And Dynamon clearly read some Carol Dweck works because he says, I failed, it doesn't matter as long as you tried your best. Oh, I didn't do that either. So the idea of trying and still failing and leaving yourself without excuses is the worst fear of fixed mindset. And therefore, people engage in a tactic called self-handicapping, which is sort of creating or reporting performance obstacles to provide excuses for failure that don't threaten self-worth. So if you think about, so the creating is, I create obstacles for real, so I don't study for the exam, so therefore I have an excuse for failing. The other strategy people do is they tell you they didn't study for the exam. So they may have spent 3 weeks studying, but they tell you, oh no, I didn't work on this at all. Because that gives them an excuse for failure. So this is not a good strategy, in fact, right? But we all engage in it because it is more, for me, back in school, right, it was scarier to study, to put all my effort into the exam and then not get an A, than it was to handicap myself and ensure that I can't get an A, but at least I had an excuse for why I didn't get an A, right? So I want to pivot now to organizational learning, and so I like this quote. It's from a study that was comparing a lot of a lot of research on learning organizations, and it says, no organizational learning can take place without individual learning and learning from development in the environment. And the organization has the power to encourage or discourage individual learning and to learn from or ignore the developments in the environment. Sorry for a long quote. But basically, the reason I spent so much time talking about personal learning is because we cannot divorce those two concepts. Organizations are comprised of humans, and therefore, if humans in the organization cannot learn, then the organization cannot learn either. And all learning requires vulnerability, and we're bad at vulnerability in our organizations as well as a personal learner. So many organization tells you that most organizations like to believe that they're a learning organization, but in fact, if we look at research, not many of them actually are. So a lot of the good learning organization theories come from Chris Auger. So he published a number of papers that are in HBR and pretty easily consumable. One of them is Teaching Smart People How to Learn. And he posits that smart people don't learn because they have too much invested in proving what they know and avoiding being seen as unknown and not knowing. So like, how many of you have been in a meeting where everybody wants to prove that they're the smartest person in the room? And therefore, they cannot possibly learn any new things because they're so invested in trying to prove themselves. And he might have been talking about growth mindset, right? Because you see the same concept here. The threat to self is a true enemy of learning. So our organizations are largely very invested in saving face. And so Chris Auger talks about another concept called the theory of action, and that's the way the organization selects the strategies to achieve objectives. And so the Model 1, there's two models, Model 1 and Model 2. They're not the opposite, but they're the most prevalent theories of action existing in our organizations. This kind of long slide, but the Model 1 says we select opinion-based objectives, and then we work to maximize winning and save face for ourselves and others, and emphasize rationality. If I had to summarize in one sentence, we select the opinion of the highest paid person in the room, and then we work really hard to prove that that opinion was correct, and we make sure that the data we collected confirms the highest paid person opinion. And we collect data so that we can say that we made the rational decision and not just opinion-based decision. Because another thing that we're really afraid of in this world is mistakes, in a fixed mindset world. So Google, you might have come across this. This is a pretty popular study. Google have conducted research of effective teams, and they looked at a ton of data, and they looked at different components, different inputs. And the results surprised them, because they expected that the most effective teams are those who comprise of like the smartest people or something like that. But really what they discovered was that the most effective teams were those who had psychological safety, defined as teams shared belief that it's okay to take risks, express ideas and concerns, and speak up with questions and to admit mistakes. And these teams were not just happier, they were actually achieving better outcomes. So they shared a piece of data on like sales teams exceeded targets by 17%, with teams with high psychological safety. And again, we see the same concepts are, oh, what just happened? Great. We see the same concepts sort of appearing, that fear is the enemy of learning. How much time do I have? Because I have confusing inputs. Cool. I'm going to talk really fast. So we talked about personal learning. We talked about organizational learning. So how can we get there? Well, cognitive learning is obviously the first step. But if knowledge was all it took, then we will all have six-pack abs. So EQ skills obviously require practice. Since I somehow have 3 minutes, sorry, my timer lied to me. This is fine. So, okay, let's learn a couple more concepts then, if I have 10 minutes. So, like, we have this is, again, Chris Argyris for you, and he talks about the concept of single versus double loop learning. So single loop learning means that we look at results and we say, if results mismatch, we're going to react and change our actions, right? And most organizations in the world are good at single loop learning because otherwise you can't make money. So if you need an analogy for a single loop learning, it's akin to a thermostat. So I set it to 72. This is Fahrenheit, obviously, otherwise you would boil. I set it to 72. And then it will make it colder if it's too hot, make it hotter if it's too cold, but it will never question the target number, right? In the double loop learning, we reflect on what we learned and we question our assumptions, not just our actions, but also our assumptions. So in double loop learning, it's a smart thermostat that can be like, okay, 72 sounds like it's inappropriate for the current environment, so I'm actually going to change the target number and not just make it colder or hotter. So most organizations in the world are actually bad at double loop learning because questioning assumptions requires changing things and a lot of times requires threatening someone's ego in the organization. So what we want, if we want a learning organization, is we want to take the ego out of the equation. And so we talked about Model 1 values, and I want to talk about Model 2 values. And Model 2, actually, if I summarize it in one sentence, says we need to create a testable hypothesis and monitor the implementation of the project to prove or disprove it. So if in Model 1 we selected our course of action based on an opinion of somebody, and then we worked really hard to prove that that opinion is correct or incorrect, and here we select a testable hypothesis, and testable here is important because we need to know that whether or not we achieved a positive outcome. So we select a testable hypothesis. We no longer have to work to prove the hypothesis, right? Because our ego isn't attached to this, but instead we engage in scientific methods saying we want to learn something. So whether or not we prove the hypothesis, we have learned something and we can adjust our outcomes. So ThoughtWorks at one point dubbed this hypothesis-driven development and says, we believe that this capability will result in this outcome, and we will know that we have succeeded when we see this measurable signal. So we can engage in more of that, more hypothesis-driven development with approach to what features we deliver to our customers, or what methodologies we implement, or anything else we want to learn in our organization. And then the other interesting pertinent concept is we talk about culture a lot at DevOps Days, and mostly we assume that to change culture, we need to change assumptions. So I need to convince you of something. And when I convince you of something, you will change your values, and that gradually will change your behavior. But in reality, the research shows that the culture change goes in the opposite direction. So to change culture, you need to actually change behavior, which will gradually impact your values, which will gradually impact your assumptions. So if we want to make people behave differently, and we want to build psychological safety, and we want to express Model 2 values rather than Model 1 and do hypothesis-driven development, we need to make it easy to do so. So anyone wanting to change a culture needs to define the actions and behaviors they desire, and then design the work processes that are necessary to reinforce these behaviors. So whenever you approach changing culture, whether it's just for you or for your family or for your organization, think about you change the behavior first, and then that impacts your values. And then the last thing I want to mention really quickly is we talk about artificial intelligence today. So I talked about human intelligence. We talk about artificial intelligence today a lot. But I think we need to start thinking about organizational intelligence. And this is because we constantly forget that all systems are socio-technical, so we cannot take the human out of the loop. And so what matters so AI is, as the gentleman said yesterday, AI is just an automation, right? And Gen AI is here to stay, and we're going to work with it for years to come. So what we need to think is about the experience of the human in the loop. So there's this I'm sure you're familiar with this, the concept of flow, being in the zone, is when challenges are matched to your skills, right? So if challenge is too hard, you experience anxiety. If challenge is too low, you experience boredom. And your ideal zone is the challenges matched to opportunity. So I think, the irony of Gen AI is that switches our role in most cases from creator to curator. So that has a potential of pushing us in either direction. So maybe it generates outputs that are incomprehensible to us, and then we are experiencing high anxiety and we cannot deal with it. Or maybe it generates largely good output, then we can't be vigilant all the time, and we assume that it's all signal and that we stop paying attention because we're bored. And I think the sort of more useful analogy would be if we thought about it sort of like a sparring partner in the matrix, and the AI is there to improve us as long as we design the workflow to favor the human experience in the loop. So if you take the main message of this talk is that the fear is the enemy of learning, and that threat to self in particular is the enemy of learning. And that threat to self can be external or internal, right? So if you're experiencing external threat, I hope you have the ability to change your environment and not have, a toxic boss or a toxic relationship of any kind. And if you're experiencing an internal threat, then I hope you have the ability to start working on developing a growth mindset. And this is not a single day affair, right? But we can get better at this. And when we get better at this, it improves not just our learning outcome, but also our overall life experience. Because the way I see it, we can either suffer while trying to prove ourselves, or we can enjoy while trying to improve ourselves. So this is for me. I'm Sasha Czarkowski. And you can find my slides and the resources for the talk on this QR code. And I really hope that we connect so we can continue this discussion.